Welcome along to episode 3 of In the Saddle with. Remember, episodes 1 and 2 still available to view and listen to on the Winners Enclosure YouTube channel or search for the podcast. Those first 2 episodes with Sylvester de Souza and Luke Morris. And for episode 3 of In the Saddle with, delighted to be joined by multiple-time broadcaster of the year, Nick Luck. Lucky, pleasure to be speaking to you. A little bit different, though. Normally, it's you asking me the questions.
Yeah, I've got to confess, and I said this to Simon Knott when he interviewed me in this room last year, I feel a lot more comfortable the other side of this Inquisition equation. I do prefer to be asking them than answering them, but if it gave me the opportunity to see you after such a long time and to hear your lovely voice, Chris, I was more than happy to oblige.
This accent isn't for everyone, Lucky, but pleased that you find it soothing.
No.
You look like you're back from your run. Is that something that you've taken up in lockdown?
I mean, it's not original, is it? There are many of us, I think, who weren't exactly regular exercise takers who suddenly downloaded Strava and are trying to pretend to be runners. My Achilles tendon has reminded me that I'm the wrong side of 40. But I have tried, and I have been trying, and there were 1 or 2 of our colleagues, Chris, who I think were a bit humbled by the fact that I managed to do the 5K in not a completely disgraceful time. So they're amazing. They all got much quicker overnight because the sheer embarrassment of me being able to do it was putting them to shame.
What was your time, Lucky?
Oh, it wasn't anything special. It was like 26 minutes or something. So it wasn't horrific.
You kept going.
I kept going. That's exactly it. I can't run. I just kept going.
You got an action a bit like attraction, a bit unorthodox.
Terrible, way worse. Because at least attraction was kind of symmetrical. So her legs were splayed and she was sort of doing this. So I'm kind of all like this. And somebody sent me the video of the clip of Lisa Kudrow. It was Phoebe and Friends, wasn't it, when she went out for a run and kind of looked like all over the shop. I wouldn't even. Somebody said I wouldn't fetch much of the sales. I wouldn't get to the sales. They'd have shot me long before that.
You can't say that.
I just did.
Oh well. We're going to discuss various things along the way. I want to largely focus on a lot of your memories from covering the sport and some of the greats of the last 20 years you've probably been covering the sport, and we'll look back at some of your highlights on along the way. But right now we're in a strange time, a difficult time potentially for racing. What do you think are the challenges coming up for the sport on the back of the country being locked down when things do get going again?
Like every walk of life, massive financial challenge. And it's actually been fleshed out by a few industry personnel recently. Richard Fitzgerald, who we both have worked for because Racecourse Media Group's the parent company of RacingTV, he came on my show the other day and said that he thought that the media rights shortfall was in the tens of millions per month. So they've got to find a way of getting that back. Obviously, there's been no wagering on the sport since March, so there's a massive shortfall with that revenue stream. So it's trying to get the money back and trying to conserve the pot that we've got. Luckily, the levy yield this year was a little bit higher than we anticipated, up in the north 90 millions. So at least there is something to work with. And the strategy the sport's gone with is to cream off the top and bolster the bottom. Which, I mean, you're a much more prolific racehorse owner than me, and you have horses going all through the class grades. I mean, you probably agree that if you're going to keep money in the bottom, you're going to retain more individual owners, and I suppose in the short term that's what we've got to try and do.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you know in an ideal world we would have good prize money at the top and it would filter through right to the bottom, because something that we might want to talk about later, actually, British racing's stature on the world stage, because in prize money terms we're not great, but in terms of overall quality we've got some of the best, and it's a strange equation really, and staying in that position with world powers in racing seeming to be on the up, holding our position as to where we are is a difficult one. But is the principal challenge then that we've got in the short term a financial one?
Oh, definitely, without any doubt. And it's through every sector of the industry. You've got to hope that all the people who make up the horse racing's workforce remain employed, but it's probably a vain hope. There are going to be people who are no longer going to be in a job. There are going to be small businesses that aren't able to survive, because in the government's rescue package, I wouldn't say small businesses done particularly well. So there are small businesses that won't be able to survive. We won't see the knock-on effect of how many owners stay in the game until next year. What we've got to hope for is to put out a really good product, so plenty of people still want to bet on that product. And the likelihood is we are going to get some sort of a head start on other sports. So hopefully that revenue will be significant through the next few months, and we can capitalize on that opportunity through all the media channels.
Yeah, you said that, you mentioned opportunity. Is there potentially an opportunity for racing, given that it's penciled in, at least at this stage, to be one of the first sports back on the go? And, people probably at home more. It takes place right the way through the afternoon into the evening. Is there an opportunity for the sport to grow somehow in difficult times?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the sport will grow significantly, but I think there is a possibility that the sport can reach people that it hasn't reached before, and that whenever you do that, then there is a chance that you will convert some of those people. I mean, it is a possibility. There will be a spike of people whose interest in racing was first piqued by the period of lockdown. Much as it has been the last 6-8 weeks, there are people now who are mildly interested in American racing and Australian racing that weren't before. Now, the interesting thing is whether that will be sustained when the UK racing comes back. Similarly, if people quite like the odd bet on a horse race, will that interest be sustained when Premier League football comes back? That's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think the sport wants to beat itself up too much and try and sort of set themselves too stiff a challenge. We've just got to get on with doing what we're trying to do and doing it as best possible. But there's certainly some potential there.
Hopefully it is the case that one or two people get interested during this difficult period and become lifelong fans of the sport. Where did your interest initially come from?
Well, I would say that my family were very interested in the sport, but not obsessed with the sport. So my mother grew up around horses. Her father was working in the colonial service in Nigeria during the Second World War, and when he retired, he came back and started a riding school on the Isle of Wight in a place called Luckham, just near Shanklin, and that's where my mum grew up. And so ponies and horses were always a big part of her life, though not particularly racing. But she evented in show jumps and so forth. My dad didn't really have a background in horses at all, and then when they met, he started riding a little bit and got quite into it. And through friends, they ended up getting a horse or two. And the first horse they had in training with my father's parents was in training with Josh Gifford when he just started training, and they became good friends. They were a similar age. And Josh was my godfather. I was born in '78, so they had horses with him for about 3 or 4 years. And so they had an interest, and the racing would be on every Saturday, but they weren't kind of obsessed with it and all facets of it, and it wouldn't be on all the time in the house. And really from quite a young age, 6, 7, 8, I was just sort of fascinated with it in I suppose a much more nerdy, geeky way than anyone else in my family. Yes, I enjoyed the horses, but I was never any good as a rider particularly. And I probably rode most days until I was about 20, but I had very limited ability. But I always I just loved racing. I just loved everything about it. And then I would always have the flat racing on as well as the jumping at home. And then I spent a year in Kentucky when I left school when I was 18. And that I suppose is where I really started getting interested more in the industry as a whole, and the pedigrees and the really good flat racing as well as the jumping that I'd grown up with, really.
The background that you've got in the sport is principally in broadcasting. You've ventured out into other things, but you're obviously best known for a broadcaster. Why was it broadcasting that ultimately took your interest as an avenue into the sport that you loved?
Yeah, well, this is one of the reasons why I find it hard doing interviews like this, because the truth of it is that I'd never really had any strategy, and I haven't ever really had any strategy. I've been lucky. I'm not saying I haven't worked hard along the way. At times I have, and I'm not trying to sort of present this as an exercise in false modesty, but it wasn't as though I went through my student career and thought, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I want to do. I want to work in horse racing and I want to broadcast. And it was just a glorious set of circumstances that enabled it to happen. You know, when I was doing my master's degree at London University, and people say, "Oh, why did you do an MA?" Well, there was definitely part of me that was trying to delay the inevitable, and I was doing fine. You know, I got a degree and whatever, but I was a bit rudderless, and I didn't really know what I was going to do. I'd always, since I was sort of 12, 13, 14, wanted to write and be a journalist. But I think oh my word, what was that?
Picture
is it intact?
It is, yeah. Frankel's gone. Fall from grace, lucky.
Dear oh dear, that was spectacular.
I only put that back up this morning.
Oh my word, where was I was talking about, oh yeah, what I was going to do. So yeah, there was no grand plan really, and I think I had my head turned by wanting to be an actor for about 5 minutes. I was doing it when I was in my last year as a postgraduate. I was doing I was going to say a fringe comedy show, but should we just call it a fringe show and not oversell it? With some friends of mine called Three-Handed Woman. It started promisingly, it sort of tapered off a little bit in some of the famous fringe venues around London, like the Hen and Chickens in Islington and the Canal Cafe in Maida Vale. I do remember once we did there were, I think, 6 of us in it, and we definitely, on more than one occasion, played to an audience smaller than the cast. And I do remember the smallest audience we played to was 3 in the Broccoli Jack, made famous by Timothy Spall. Though obviously Timothy Spall wasn't in our production. In the Broccoli Jack in Southeast London, and there was a sort of middle-aged couple in the front row, and then there was one kind of unkempt guy about 3 rows back who who had just a stank of booze, and about halfway through just stood up and started abusing me. So that narrowed the audience down to 2, and I think at that point I thought, this is probably not going to make a career out of this. But it was really it's very funny, because like typical kind of students arsing around doing something like that, we always thought that some commissioner of comedy was going to come in from BBC and sign us up to be the next Fast Show or something. It didn't quite materialize. Anyway, it was around about that period that I met a man called Brian Rogers, who sadly I've lost touch with, who I knew a bit anyway. He was a sort of friend of a friend, but he had a job as a accountant essentially for the Financial Times, but he'd been made redundant from there, and he'd ended up working at this startup doing a startup digital horse racing channel, he said, not knowing I had any interest. And I went, what, at the races, this brand new shining all singing, all dancing, free to air digital channel that started up in 2002? He went, yeah. I said, God, that's amazing. I said, I watch that every day. It's so exciting, blah blah blah. He said, you'd be great on there, and they're looking for people to do American horse racing. And that's how I started.
So that was your break, pretty.
Well, he gave me Jim Ramsey's contact details. I rang Jim, and Jim put me on to Steve Meehan, who's still a producer at RacingTV. And Steve, I think, was light on options, and he put me on telly the next day. I mean, it's insane. That would never happen now. Yeah, I went in for not really an interview, but just to meet him, to the old Sky Business Studios in Hayes. And he said, would you want to do a dummy run this evening? I thought, I've bitten off more than I can chew here. They actually put me on air as a sort of dry run. It wasn't going out anywhere, but they put me in a studio with Angus McNay, and we did the American racing. And I thought, this is way more than I could really cope with. Because I remember standing outside the studio bit, and Ian Bartlett, the legendary Barty, was standing there drawing very, very slowly and theatrically on a Benson, and sort of gave me a few bits of advice. And I was a bit starstruck because I see all these people on the telly every day, and went in, and the rest isn't quite history. But anyway, then I was doing three days a week, and I said to Laura, we weren't married then, but we was still just out of university, and I said, "Oh, this will do until I get a job," and that was
still going.
That was 18 years ago.
And you've had several jobs since, all related to it. Obviously, at the races, you then branched off onto Racing UK when it started. You were in there from the inception. That's now Racing TV. You were the Channel 4 anchor for a good number of years. You've ended up working for NBC in America and loads of other things along the way. So you've ended up with a long and varied career already.
It's been a lot of fun, and I've been very lucky to do some amazing events for some absolutely brilliant production teams as well. I mean, it was always a dream to be involved in a network Grand National, and was lucky enough to do that with Channel 4. And there's very few people who've had that opportunity, and it is something really special, as the guys at ITV will tell you now, and the people at BBC will tell you before us. And they were good shows too. They were great shows. And similarly, it was a huge ambition of mine to work on a network Kentucky Derby show, which I got to do last year, and I've been itching to get on that broadcast for quite some time. So I've been involved with the Breeders' Cup for years now, and had done several for NBC, and Rob Hyland, my boss at NBC, had said so many times, I really want to get you on the Derby show, but they've got so much to pack in, and it's not the easiest sell to get the guy from England to come and join what's already an amazing team. So I was incredibly grateful to him and to the NBC for taking a chance on me and letting me do, well, at least 2/3 of the Triple Crown last year, because I ended up missing the Belmont Stakes because I had a bit of a health scare. And funnily enough, Chris, it's a year to the day that I was having that operation, which took out. Well, I was going what it actually took out, I won't tell you, but I don't want to put people off their food, but it took out a little portion of last summer. So I'm very grateful that what could have been a lot worse wasn't. And interrupting my Triple Crown was kind of a secondary consideration, really.
Yeah, and I suppose you would have been on it this year, would you?
Yeah, we were all set. I mean, bits of it may still happen. I mean, the Belmont's June 20th, and I think Trump's lockdown is still going to be enforced then. So I don't think I'll be able to get there until later in the year. Kentucky Derby, September the 5th, maybe. I mean, who knows? I hope so. I really hope so. And some of the Breeders' Cup Challenge races, because the variety really has been what's been great about the last 3 or 4 years, and I think it makes you better here when you do some work there, and it makes you better there when you do sort of different things here. So I quite like being freshened up by slightly different challenges.
Yeah, you will spend nowadays a lot of your time covering the top quality racing. You cut your teeth, as you said, covering American racing that, in truth, probably not that many people were bothered about at the time. It would have been some of the lower grade stuff from some of the gaffs, I suppose. Then you went around the tracks around Britain, out on the course. It's not always been the top venues, but is it ultimately covering those big meetings that gives you a real buzz?
Yeah, definitely, because you need something to get your. I mean, I always loved the smaller meetings anyway, so I'd always make as much effort for the smaller meetings, but your adrenaline doesn't flow as readily as it does when something huge is happening. And I think that, and obviously as time goes on, you almost need the event to be bigger to get you going, because you've experienced so much, but you need something new. It's something you haven't done before or something different to get you just that little bit nervous. I think it's always good just to be a little bit a little bit nervous, a little bit on edge, because it focuses your mind and makes you concentrate a bit more and stops you becoming blasé and stops you not trying as hard as you should be trying. And obviously you want to appear relaxed all the time, but you know, it's like if you're doing an interview where you're not, it's complicated and you're not absolutely sure of everything, it just gives you that extra adrenaline rush that focuses you and helps you concentrate.
Talk about being a little bit nervous. I did my first ever Racing UK, as it was then, shift with you at Nottingham, a small minor meeting, and I was absolutely shitting myself.
Were you really?
Yeah,
it never came across.
You stand next to the entrance to the paddock at Nottingham, don't you?
Yeah,
and they've
you're
moved
quite
it now. There was a white metal railing, and I just remember gripping onto it, thinking, I just don't want to fall over. I was absolutely petrified. It was terrible. But having worked with you a number of times since, including lucky enough to cover some of the big meetings with you, I also worked on some of the smaller meetings with you. And the reason I brought it up was you said about variety, and you still do actually enjoy you wouldn't want to be going around the small tracks every day of the week. But I know when we've turned up at, I think, somewhere like Thirsk, for example, and you've kind of said, I'm actually really looking forward to this today. And it was probably like a Tuesday night in the middle of summer.
Right now, you would really look forward to anything, wouldn't you? I mean, you'd look for. I only live 4 miles from Kempton, and I have a bit of a not a love affair would be putting it too strongly, but I do actually really like the place. But clearly, your Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday stuff is not something you'd necessarily rush to see. But boy, oh boy, I'll take as much Kempton as you give me right now. But yeah, I tell you what I really loved. What I really loved at the beginning of my career was, or the beginning of Racing TV definitely, was doing so many different race courses in here in this country. Because I suppose from about 2004 to 2010, 2011, I went everywhere, and I absolutely loved that, because it's not as though as a child I'd been around every single race course. It wasn't as though I wasn't like a trainer's kid I wasn't a track rat, as they call them in America. I wasn't someone who'd grown up in Newmarket. So there were all these places I'd never been to, didn't know the people particularly well, and getting to know all the different people in all different sections of all different parts of the country and sections of the industry was great, and a great experience, and not something really people get to do so much now. When they come into broadcasting, people tend to be quite regionalized and not go everywhere, and I think going everywhere is quite important. I'll never forget being at in the old press room at Epsom, the first or second Derby I covered, and a senior member of the racing media then asked me to point out who Richard Fahey was, because he'd never come across it. And I mean, it sounds insane now, doesn't it? This is, I don't know, 15, 16 years ago. And because I had been spending so much time in Yorkshire covering the racing, knew everybody was up there. And then that's building up your contacts and building up a network and knowing who people are, knowing what's going on. That's all part of being a good reporter, I think, and doing your job properly.
Yeah, it must be something, those connections that you've built over time must be something that's helped quite a lot.
It helps when you're trying to book 7 people for a Sunday morning program, that's for sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Look on Sunday, so I may as well, seeing you've brought it up. That's something very different to what you've done in the past, but it's been extremely popular. Is it something that you really enjoy now?
Yeah, I do. I do really enjoy it, and I have done right from the outset. And I'm lucky that Racing TV gave me the opportunity to start it, and initially that Hong Kong gave us the financial ability to start it, even though they dropped out after one season. It then was sort of standing on its own 2 feet, so it could carry on, and other sponsors came in, Al Bastian and so on. So it was a great opportunity to get, and there wasn't really a program of that nature at the time. And now there are several, so that I think hopefully is a tick in the box for the show, and so many people have worked hard on it, and especially Bruce Clements, who's off at the moment but will be back soon hopefully, and Ben Wong and John McCormack in his place, and Christina McElhinney as well. So it's thanks to their hard work, really, and everybody sort of getting behind it and enjoying what we do, that it's been allowed to carry on.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of become a must-see program. As I say, it's a different
very
sort
kind of you to say, Chris.
It's a different format to covering live racing, but it's one that suits you really well as the live racing. Would you like to do that in other settings away from racing ultimately, or is that not something you think about?
I think about it less now than I did, because if an opportunity came up, then I'm sure I'd look at it and take it. And did I want to diversify a little bit more than yes, I suppose so. But I'm happy. I'm very happy in that format. So yeah, if I could get into other areas in a similar role, then I'd be happy to explore those.
Of all the work that you do now, it's quite different. What's been your favourite experience along the way of the different sort of channels that you've covered, in a sense? Because each offers a different type of experience for the viewer. Each Racing TV would cover the sport in a different way to what ITV do now and what Channel 4 did, and NBC will be different again. Which do you enjoy most?
Oh my God, I've enjoyed them all for different reasons. I really have. Those 4 years when I was a bigger part of the Channel 4 team. I mean, I'd worked for Channel 4 Racing for quite a long time before they then got all the racing rights. But those 4 years were an insane roller coaster, emotionally draining. The changes were not to everybody's liking. We knew that, and ultimately it was probably to cost the network the contract. But it was both fulfilling and frustrating in equal measure. But it was a very intense period, I would say. Before that, there'd been a relaunch of an earlier relaunch of the morning line, which again was quite heavily publicised. So, still relatively young, and early on in my career, I was subjected to quite a lot of scrutiny and pressure that, looking back on it now, was reasonably intense and not that straightforward. But it was good learning experience, and probably made me a little bit more philosophical about the brickbats that you need to face if you're going to do this job. And there's all sorts of interesting experiences there. Racing TV has been a great constant, and just provides you with that ability to get close to the action on such a regular basis. And it's this, when you're out of nick in terms of your connection with the sport, and having that constant access to it is really important. And also being part of it from the very beginning, from the first show with Rishi, and Jason Weaver was on that first day. I think Peter Norton was on the first day. Being part of that very first day of a new channel is always exciting. The American work's been incredibly fulfilling, from ESPN back in 2006 right the way through till now. Again, it was a lucky break getting that opportunity in the first place, and once I got it, I didn't really want to let it go. So yeah, they've all contributed in different ways. I wouldn't say there's necessarily one part of my career that's been more exciting than any other. Yeah,
the racing that you covered in America now is probably a fairly big part of your commitments, broadcasting and work-wise. How does racing in America differ from that in Britain, in as much as anything, the way that it's seen by racing fans, the way that it's followed and covered?
It's funny because it's such a big country, but you get the feeling that at the top level, it's an even tighter audience. Yes, you might get a massive audience for the Triple Crown races, but you almost get the feeling that the racing bubble, the racing village, is almost even tighter in the States than it is here. There's such a traveling circus element to it. I will quite often see the same 50 to 100 people wherever I go, because I'm lucky enough that I'm doing all the good stuff, because that's the stuff that NBC cover. And I think it's even more difficult there to get that casual audience, to get eyes on the sport, than it is here. And funnily enough, they've had the opportunity we were talking about earlier in the last few weeks, because racing's the only sport that's been going. So there've been great tracts of coverage from TVG, the horse racing channel there, just being simulcast on NBC Sports.
And has that had a big take-up?
Yeah, the viewing figures are very solid, because there aren't really many other games in town or any other games in town.
Yeah. Is there a big difference in the way that the sport is covered? Because I don't watch much American racing, but I always tune into the Breeders' Cup night, for example. And I love the way that is done as like a production of racing. I really enjoy watching the way that they cover the racing. Is there a big difference?
Yeah, it's faster paced. There's no doubt about that. It moves around more. It's faster paced. It certainly on the network shows there is more precision. It's not as loose in production wise. But I think the styles suit the countries. I think if you were trying to adopt a strictly American style here, it would kind of look awkward to people. And similarly, I find if they try and, I've been on a couple of shows in the US where you try and loosen things up a bit, and sometimes that doesn't quite work. They seem to be better suited to that slightly tighter production.
Are the betting cultures in the two countries different as well?
Well, yeah, because there's so much more emphasis on exotic wagering in the States. Everything's about exotic wagering. You very rarely find anybody who takes himself seriously as a punter who turns up and says, yeah, I'm going to have one bet today or two bets today, and they're both going to be win bets. It's all about how you play a race, the wagering strategy in each particular race.
Is that something? Sorry, carry on. Sorry.
No, I was going to say. So it's not just that you're trying to find the winner. You're looking to try and assess the entire shape of the race.
Yeah,
which I guess is what you do as well, but with a slightly different result at the end of it. But I think it's a question of, right, what's going to make the running, what's going to do this, what's going to do that. Which is I think a slightly different way of approaching it to how people here would traditionally approach betting on a horse race.
Is that something that you think could become more popular in this country, given the right type of bets being there?
Well, you need more. The thing, you need more information, don't you? You need access to more data in order to have that approach, because you need to have in front of you and more readily available the likely scenarios that are going to unfold in the race, which you don't get at first glance here.
Yeah,
which you do get at first glance when you're looking at cards and form in the US. You don't have to be a real expert to be able to interpret what's going to happen in a race just by looking at the form in the States. Whereas, you kind of do here. You need to apply yourself to it much more rigorously here if you want to have access to all that information, or you need to start taking your own sectionals or whatever.
Yeah, there's certainly differences between the two. Let's get on to some of the things you've enjoyed most covering the sport, because, as I said, over the course of the last 20 years nearly, you've covered some of the greats, including the likes of Frankel and See the Stars. Are there two horses that you look back on fondly?
I'll never forget See the Stars winning the Eclipse. I think that was his, in many ways, a defining performance, because we knew what he'd done against his own generation with wins in the Guineas and the Derby. And it's easy to forget that at that time, he was the first horse since Nash won to win the Guineas and the Derby in the same season. And it was almost getting to the point where we thought it couldn't happen again, I think, in 2009, and then it did. There'd been a yawning gap since '89 when Nash won had done it. And then when it came to the Eclipse, and he had that terrific battle with Rip Van Winkle, with Conduit back in third, like a dual Breeders' Cup turf hero, well beaten. And he had to show class and guts in a fast time on very fast ground. It was a very hot day at Sandown. Christopher Choi, the owner, passed out on the way from the grandstand to the winners' enclosure, if you remember.
Yeah.
And I was working with Eddie Fremantle on Racing UK, as it was at the time. And I remember Eddie getting the horse was as close to, I could touch him over the rail, essentially. And I remember this magnificent horse going back into the winners' enclosure, and I distinctly remember Eddie almost losing the ability to speak because he got so choked up, got so emotional, because there was this real connection with this beautiful animal, this elite thoroughbred, this amazingly bred horse who who could seemingly do anything. And this is obviously, as you say, this is before Frankel. So I think we were craving, flat racing was craving a real once in a generation superstar, which it hadn't had for quite some time. And there it was. Everything about this horse was perfect. He looked perfect. He raced kindly and beautifully. He could do anything. He could beat his elders. He was taking a brave route that other horses hadn't taken in recent years, and his connections were quite easy to warm to. It was Canaan in the glorious autumn of his career. There were so it was that was a lovely season with See the Stars. And the other great Aidan O'Brien made it to a certain extent as well, because he had 4 or 5 really talented 3-year-olds that year, and he kept throwing them at him, and See the Stars kept beating him, and he kept doing everything he could to try and get him beaten, and that's what made it so much fun to cover. The Juddmonte International, if you said to somebody, right, what we're going to do is we're going to have a horse race, all 4 participants are going to be trained in Ireland, and 3 of them are going to be trained by Aidan O'Brien, and 2 of them are pacemakers. You'd think, well, that's a contender for world's most boring race. I don't want to watch this. It's the sort of thing that, television executives and prolific tweeters would spend days and days moaning about: small fields, domination of superpowers, etc. But you had the most compelling horse race you could possibly imagine, Master Craftsman, and the way that O'Brien tried to beat See the Stars, and See the Stars, even though he wasn't fully fit that day, managed to nearly break the track record and produce a ridiculous performance on the clock to beat a very talented and tough horse. It was great. And there was everything about that season was wonderful, and he was probably over the top when he won the Arc as well.
Yeah. And a few years down the line, Frankel came along, and it was like we had another superstar on the back of See the Stars, and it really was sort of a bit of a golden age for flat racing with those 2 coming along at the time, because you mentioned there'd been a big gap without the same kind of star. We had Galileo was a star in a sense for a different reason, for all that he was a brilliant horse on the track, but these were real superstars that we hadn't really seen, you could argue, since the 80s. When Frankel came along, what do you think was, 2 questions, the best performance of his career and maybe the most memorable?
Well, if you're talking clinically, the best performance of his career was probably the Queen Anne, when he beat Acceleration by so far. I think that was clear. That clinically, that was the best performance. It didn't touch you in the way that some of his other performances did. The first day, first race of Royal Ascot, I was actually in the grandstand for that race. I was watching as a spectator that day. I wasn't working that afternoon, and I just remember that was the reaction. Everyone was applauding from about the 2 furlong pole, but it wasn't a visceral excitement that overtook the crowd. York was, when he won the Juddmonte International. There were so many layers of significance in that performance. First time stepping up in distance, new pool of horses. People genuinely thought he might be vulnerable. I remember standing outside the Grange Hotel in York, and a couple walking past who I didn't know, middle-aged couple, and they gave me 10 minutes on how and why Frankel was going to be beaten the next day. And they were absolutely convinced of it as well. And look what he did. Look what he did to St Nicholas Abbey and Farm. And Steve Mellish was doing a lovely piece on it the other day. And it was that was a wonderful performance that really tugged at the heartstrings. And obviously, Henry Cecil was extremely ill at the time, and had taken a bit of a downturn, but was absolutely determined to be there and supervising proceedings and so forth. And the counterpoint between his frailty and the horse's brilliance was that was an extraordinary day. That was an intoxicating day. The atmosphere in the York finishes early because you get 6 races at that Ebor Festival, and everyone's piled into the bars. The atmosphere on those lawns when that day had finished, when we came off air, was just like unlike anything I've ever experienced on a racetrack.
Yeah, that was definitely my favourite Frankel day. I think obviously the Guineas, when he was just storming clear, was a great race as well. And actually, there's parts of his career that you kind of link back up to the broadcasting, and specifically with the commentary, and Barty's commentary of that Guineas was brilliant, wasn't it?
15 lengths clear. Yeah, the disbelief in his voice it's just brilliant. It's just brilliant. It was. I've just spent 5 minutes saying how wonderful the See the Stars season was, and there's nothing I have to say that's negative about See the Stars. But these comparisons that people put up now between the two are just preposterous. Frankel is the best horse any of us are ever likely to see in the flesh, unless you saw Secretariat in the early 1970s, or you saw Seabird in the flesh. Frankel is the best horse you are ever likely to see.
Yeah, but you've answered my next question, because it was 10 furlongs, good ground, See the Stars, or Frankel.
That's not just wins. Stop the fight. Frankel just wins every time, and you feel bad, but then See the Stars was a brilliant horse, a brilliant horse, but he didn't do anything that made you say, how on earth, how the hell was that possible? How the hell is that possible? Probably half a dozen times in Frankel's career, you went, how did he do that?
Yeah, including probably the day that he nearly got beat at Royal Ascot when.
Yeah, when Tom Queally took a lot of unfair criticism for that, because everyone could see what he'd done in the Guineas. And that was planned as well. And I was never sure that he should have been the one taking all the flack for the execution of the St James's Palace. And anyway, he still got a one by his name. You don't always have to show you're working to get the right result.
No, absolutely not. I said there about Barty's commentary and things. There's a number of points along the way as well, where with those two horses and other horses that we'll come to discuss in a second, that you've kind of been the first person to react. Your mic goes live, you get the cue, Nick, and you've got to deliver something that encapsulates the moment. And without blowing smoke up your backside, you tend to get it right.
You're more than welcome. Isn't that what this is all about?
But you tend to get it right. Is that something that you've thought about beforehand, or do you just use your knowledge of the situation, how you're feeling, to deliver whatever line it is you come up with to immediately react to that performance?
No, I don't prepare lines off the back of races. I think you just have to say it how you feel it. Otherwise it's not authentic. I mean, I think it would be different if you were a commentator, which is obviously a far harder and more technically skilled pursuit. But I enjoy trying to sum up what I've seen in a few sentences and just kind of putting a button on the race. But I don't know. I don't think you can really prepare it. You can prepare, but I don't think you can write lines or imagine what you're going to say.
Is that for you one of the best things about your job, that initial reaction? Because people are going to watch these videos for years to come, and they'll hear your reaction. You must take a bit of pride in that.
To be honest, it's not something I've massively thought about. Sometimes I've gone back and listened to or pulled up a Frankel race, for example, or an old Cheltenham race or something, and then you hear your voice back and go, oh, that's or a See the Stars Derby I watched the other day, and you know how you look back at old photos and think, oh, I had more hair then, or God, I look young. You can actually sound. Sometimes if I've heard myself back, I'm like, my God, I actually even sounded younger and more vital and more enthusiastic. I was much better in 2008 than I am now.
I was watching back some Porto Star memories a little while ago, and you picked up on the back of some of those performances, I think including at Haydock one day, where it was a spine-tingling performance because he'd had his down spell by then and he bounced back.
That was the fifth Betfair Chase, wasn't it? Or fourth, or
yeah.
Was it fourth or fifth? Fourth. 2011.
Yeah. Did you enjoy that?
That was a super day. That was one of the, certainly I think it was the best days jumping at Haydock I can remember. Great atmosphere. Yeah, that was a wonderful day. Wonderful day.
How do you look back on his career with fondness?
Who, Corto Star?
Yeah.
I think he's an amazing horse because Nichols does seem to be able to do it, and jumps trainers nowadays do seem to be able to do it more than they could in days gone by, because veterinary medicine's better, training techniques are better, gallops are better. They can bring horses back more effectively, and you do get a second. Sometimes you get a second bite of the cherry if they've got a bit disappointing. Certainly when I was growing up, and probably the same for you, Chris, if a jumps horse had started to deteriorate, they were no way going to find their way back to the level that had characterized their earlier performances. Now I think it's more, we saw Paul Colin Tizard did it with Q-Car.
Yeah.
He sort of had a little dip and then bang, had this glorious renaissance. Now with the way they treat leg injuries, the way they operate on horses' wind and keep doing that over and over again, it meant that. But I think it was still unusual with Kauto Star. I think after the Punches Down debacle and whatnot, to bring him back to do what he did was pretty special.
Denman was in the same yard at the same time.
Did
you prefer Denman to Kauto, or?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did, really. I think partly because I took a very strong view before the 2008 Gold Cup that Denman would beat Kauto Star. I mean, I haven't got many things right since, but there was also this narrative at the time that you shouldn't have a bet in the race, you should just watch it, and which I always thought was insane, because you were asking people to take a very strong view either which way. So you're getting the entire sort of population of racing enthusiasts to turn into columnists and to give very trenchant, strong opinions one way or the other. And having asked them to take very trenchant, strong opinions, you're then saying to them, "But yeah, actually, but don't have a bet, just watch the race." So you kind of have both ways. If you've got that strong an opinion, then 2-1, whatever he was, get your money down. So yes, I did enjoy Denman's eclipse of Kauto Star in the Gold Cup, and I agree with Rich. I personally agree with Richard Hoyles' view on this, which is that nothing would have beaten Denman on that day. And there was a lot after the race about Kauto Star not being at his best. Maybe the winner Ascot had taken it out of him the time before. He'd had a little foot problem, I think, after Ascot, or something that had not been quite right. Ruby said he never quite felt. Whatever. On that day, there was a portion of the race, I think the 9 furlongs from when they passed the stands with one circuit to run until the top of the hill, where Denman just ripped the heart out of all his opponents.
Yeah,
absolutely brilliant. Unfortunately, he didn't do his own heart any good either, and he was never quite the same horse again. But God, he was good that day.
Yeah, he was outstanding that day, and as you say, he never bounced back. Kauto did, but maybe on the day, Denman broke Kauto, but ultimately Denman broke himself.
He did, but he did. I mean, he did still produce one of the great weight carrying performances of all time in a second Hennessy, and was second in 3 subsequent Gold Cups. So, Nichols still did get him back. He still got him back to an insanely good level. And I think again, it was an era where horses were doing something that hadn't hitherto seemed possible, and that's why it was exciting.
There were 2 great staying chasers that you'll have covered. The 2 mile division is one that has been brilliant over fences during the course of your career, with the likes of Moscow Flyer, who had those battles with the like of Azertiup and Well Chief. I would imagine you were covering it at that time. Altior, Sprinter Sacra too, that Nicky Henderson had. There's been some brilliant 2 milers in recent times. Yeah,
and I was so part of my youth really was spent devoted to the 2 miling era of Viking Flagship and Deep Sensation and so forth. So I love that particular discipline. And if you're talking about, we talked about Frankel as the greatest flat horse that I'm ever likely to see. Sprinter Sacra, in terms of raw freakish ability, is probably the best jumps horse I'm ever likely to see. And my admiration for Desert Orchid is just off the chart. I was lucky enough to be at all 4 of his King George wins when I was a child. My admiration for Kauto Star likewise, and Denman, but Sprinter Sacra, again, it's that, did he just do that? Is that possible? Is it possible that he can, there was the famous match race between him and Peddler's Cross, which got me into all sorts of trouble with Donald McCain at the time. because I was there covering that. And there's this. Badlands Cross wasn't a particularly big horse. He was a classy looking horse, but a classy looking, small to medium sized horse. Lovely horse. Second in a champion hurdle. Wow, real class act. Donald McCain said, best horse I'm still ever likely to train. Turns up and in walks Sprinter Sacre, and you thought, well, you may as well stop the fight now, ref, frankly. And he had him done in 2 fences. He had a champion hurdle runner-up who'd gone down to Hurricane Fly by that much. He had him done in 2 fences. He was just he was ridiculous when he was on song. That horse, ridiculous.
What do you think was the best? What was the main attribute that Sprinter Sacre had? Because he had several, but what was the one that stands out?
Well, speed, I suppose. I mean, he was just so fast. He was just he was effortless, and he would have most horses are slowing down at the end of their races, but he would slow down so much less quickly than all his rivals that it was just quite remarkable to watch. I mean, the time he thrashed an on-song cue card at Aintree was just beyond compare. And what he did in the Arkle and his first champion chase, and nothing would have got anywhere near him.
Yeah, and I think speed is a good way of putting it, actually, because he had speed in every sense, didn't he? Speed in the way that he went through the middle part of a race, I suppose, so easily. Speed relative to the others at the end of a race, and speed through the air at his fences as well. Everything about him was just quick.
Yeah, and he was quite unusual because he was very economical for a big horse. So he wasn't wasting a ton of ground at his fences, even though he was quite a tall, imposing horse. He didn't think he was going to be a handy horse, but he was deadly quick at his obstacles. And his speed away from the fences as well.
How do you think Altior compares to where Sprinter Sacre was?
Probably about a stone behind.
Right. As much as that?
Yeah. I think so.
Moscow Flyer?
Probably somewhere between the two.
Yeah.
I would put Sprinter Sacre and Moscow Flyer above Altior, even though I think Altior's a wonderful horse. I think I'd put them both above him at their best. So
we've talked about there, Lucky, some of the best horses you've seen. Are they also your favourite horses, or have you got fonder memories, in a sense, of one or two others?
Oh, I've got fonder memories of others because obviously you fall in love with horses for different reasons, don't you? I mentioned Desert Orchid. He'd have been one of the first for sure, because that was my childhood, really, going to Kempton and watching him win the King George every time. And then horses in the 90s, I mentioned following Josh Gifford's horses, which I did in a ridiculously obsessive fashion. His son Nick will tell you, I think he's still got them, like lists I used to compile with, all the jockeys and SPs and dates of the winners. And there were a lot of winners in those days as well. And so Deep Sensation was one of those. I kind of loved him because he was infuriating. And if he did win a big race, you sort of felt doubly rewarded because it always looked as though he was going to win and didn't.
Yeah.
So I've got quite a soft spot for horses who people don't like or call ungenuine or whatever, because it normally means they're very good and they're saving a bit for themselves. So I was a big fan of his early on. A first flat horse that I can ever really remember having an affinity for was Nashwan, and of course that's 20 years before See the Stars. And it was that Guineas Derby thing it seemed extraordinarily exciting, and it was very much in the news at the time, and it had a good human interest story as well with what had happened to Dick Hearn. A horse is sort of close to my heart for personal reasons. Well, obviously the Great Hawk Mountain. He was a big part of my life at a fun part of my career as well. So you've owned a ton more horses than me, but if you've got a horse that can just take you to York at every meeting, then you should cherish that. And I thought this was just the way it was, and it's since then I realised it's a bit more difficult than that. So to have a winner at the Ebor meeting with him was massively exciting. I wasn't there, of course. I was probably racing 200 odd times a year then, around the sort of late noughties, and I never once saw him win, ever.
Were you working the day that, I don't want to bring up a bad day, but the day that he got chinned at York?
Yeah, I was working every time he got chinned at York. He got chinned 3 times at York, from I can remember. Once by a grey horse of William Muir's. Then he got, the time he got done was one of those 45,000 sweltering, sweaty, sunny Saturdays. Mark Johnson was commentating, and he got done by Mudawin, who'd come down the ex-Ebor winner, who'd come down the handicap, a stone and a half, and got a canny ride from John Egan. And Graham Gibbons sent Hawke to the front 3 out and got nailed late on. That was quite painful. And then he got done by one of the Bollins, I think, one day as well. But yeah, he was fantastic. But he won on the day that it mattered.
Which day was that?
Under a Jamie Spencer ride of inspired proportions. God, he was unbelievable. I mean, it probably would have got him about a 6-month whip ban now, but it was brilliant at the time.
But it's clear, just as you're recalling those memories, he's probably the horse that stands out, isn't he, for you? Because you had the added interest of him being yours.
Well, apart mine, yeah. I mean, I had a leg in him, yeah. But they were just fun. They were fun times as well. They were fun times. Not much pressure, and yeah, we enjoyed the experience of having him as well. It was good. It was good. And as I say, just to turn up to that very special place with a chance pretty much every time he ran was a lot of fun.
Yeah, not everyone is fortunate to be in a position where they can earn a horse, but syndicates do offer a lot more people a chance now. Is it something that you would say to racing fans, have a go at if you can, because of the experience it gives you?
Definitely. And I actually think that, I got a phone call the other day from someone I hadn't seen in 15, 16 years saying, can you recommend a syndicate that I can buy a share of for my husband's birthday? Well, I mean, they didn't want to spend more than 100, 150 quid or whatever, but there are, you do have options now to be able to do it and get quite a lot of fun out of it. So I definitely would. I mean, this is the future. The owner who has a horse in training is disappearing, has all but disappeared. Somebody, that was kind of the staple of ownership in the 70s, 80s, 90s. You could go back through an old horses in training from the mid 90s or late 80s, and you'll find a trainer with, say 60 horses. There'd be 50 different owners, Mr. So-and-so and Mrs. Such and such and whatever. Even partnerships were unusual, let alone syndicates. But the cost reward ratio now, it makes it almost impossible for an individual owner, let's say what I would call the old 1 or 2 horse owner, to operate. So you've either got people who are trying to run it as a bit of a business, with friends or with business partners, a bit like you guys do. It's a bit of fun, but it's a bit of, you want to make it pay as well. Or you've got people who are running big syndicates, or you've got the ultra high net worth who can afford to spend several million in training fees every year. And those are your ownership groups.
What was the most enjoyable part of owning horses for you with Hawke Mountain, and now with other horses that you've got bits of as well?
I don't, just sort of plotting your way through the season and wondering how your campaign's going to unfold. And as I say, it's quite often that you can't actually get to the races when they run. So, and because we're lucky enough, you and I are lucky enough to go racing so much anyway, that's not part of that's not the kind of bit of the leisure experience, if you like, that makes it fun for us. It's all these stuff that goes around it, all the plotting and the planning and that's where we get our pleasure, I suppose. Whereas if you've got a high octane, intense job outside the horse racing industry, or even if you've got a very low octane job, very boring job, then it can either give you a release if it's the former, or it can give you the excitement if it's the latter. So owning a racehorse can provide you with something that otherwise you don't have in your in your life. Whereas for us, we have racing in our lives every day, so it gives you something slightly different.
Yeah, just quickly move on to a couple of other things I wanted to chat with you about. First of all, we've discussed some great horses, and they're principally the stars of the show, but trainers and jockeys form a big part of it as well. Are there any in particular that, as a broadcaster, you sort of look forward to speaking to?
Oh, loads, yeah, loads. We're very lucky. I know there are obvious examples of trainers and jockeys who are more reticent than others, but we've got so many personalities who are so accessible in the sport. You were talking about the Sunday program earlier, and that's one of the great things about having the opportunity to talk to them every week. You just build this incredibly different cast of characters, and I do think racing gets good access. I really do, and it didn't have a reputation for giving good access when I started, but it really does now. Also different. Who do I enjoy talking to? Well, there's sort of the obvious answers like Frankie Dettori and John Gosden. They're always going to give plenty, but some of the more you look at somebody like Rafe Beckett, for example, whose interview the other day with me raised a few eyebrows, and he's always prepared to say what he thinks. You're never going to be let down because he's always going to provide you with something interesting. He's going to think about what he's going to say. You might not agree with it, but he's going to think about what he says, and delivers a punchy opinion off the back of it. And that's the case with so many of the jockeys are getting so much better as well. They're media trained much better. Lydia does a lot of the work with the young apprentice jockeys at the racing school, and that's really paid dividends in recent years. They arrive at fully formed media professionals. That definitely wasn't the case 10 years ago. The younger jockeys now are very assured. Okay, we know about Sheen Murphy. He is he's an unusual media performer. They're not all like him, but they're very, very good. You take somebody like Jason Watson, for example, who probably isn't naturally that outgoing, but when you watch him interview, him, he's very smart, on the ball, thinks about what he says, good communicator, and that applies to so many of the younger riders now.
Do you enjoy the interviews that are a bit more of a challenge as well? Speaking to the people that aren't as natural, and you kind of move it along and get more out of them than would usually be the case.
Yeah, if you get something good out of them, you do. Yeah, if it falls on flat on his ass, not so much. But yeah, if you get something good out of somebody who tends to be a bit more reticent or not that willing to say too much, then yeah, you do. You get a big kick out of it.
And in terms of talent in the saddle and ability of training a horse, who do you rate particularly highly, away from maybe the obvious?
Well, it's probably a good. I mentioned just a minute ago Jason Watson. I think he's phenomenally talented because he's been very quickly. He went from appearing on the scene with hardly any experience to riding 100 winners to getting a job with Roger Charlton. And I'm thinking, was that the right job for him at this point in time? Because you got a few quite nice horses to ride, but are you going to get the volume to keep you going? And he looked very comfortable in group races very early on, with some quite tricky, one or two quite tricky rides as well. I think he's exceptionally good. Tom Marquand, I think, is looking the business now. There's not anything particularly original there, but he really did look the business in Australia for William Haggas, didn't he? And I think that partnership this season is going to be deadly. I was just looking through. Yeah, I don't know how you found it. I've forgotten half the horses that are about to run. You asked me to name a bunch of horses. I've forgotten half of them.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly you sort of lose touch when you're so used to being immersed in it all the time. 2 months of not really following it, and your mind's gone a bit blank.
Completely. Like, you asked me to name a bunch of £7 claimers from last season, I've gone completely to draw a complete blank. But I do think that Marquand Haggas thing could be, they could be pushing through to the next level yet, I think.
Yeah.
You could almost find one of theirs for every one of Gosden and Dettori's almost.
Yeah.
In the big races in another season or two.
Yeah, more to come from that pair. Been talking a fair while now, so we'll crack on to the last bit and your horses to follow, Lucky, and we'll start with William Hagger's horse.
Yeah, I managed to find 5 that I could actually remember. None of them are going to be terribly original, and they've all, I'm sure, appeared in other various books and publications and lists and so forth. But Born with Pride. Now, any horse that wins a listed race on his or her debut is clearly going to be very talented. My slight reservation is that she's a half to a couple of horses who weren't exactly lion-hearted in Raheen House, who really didn't like to go by very much, and Shreo, who needed the unkindest cut to and I think 1 or 2 runs over hurdles, and then a trip to Australia to see him finally fulfill his potential. So there is a little bit of a worry there, but I'm hoping the stability of the top side of the pedigree will provide a bit of heart, and certainly just showed an enormous amount of ability, albeit in very soft ground, to win on debut. And I don't really mind with stables like this when they go off at 16 to 1 or whatever first time out, because A, it was an unusual call to run in a listed race first up anyway, and secondly, I'd never take it as a bad sign if horses surprise connections on the race course, because you normally find that they will do it again. So Born with Pride would be the first one.
Yeah, as you said, listed winner on debut in deep ground at Newmarket. Second horse you've got was one of Hugo Palmer's, who was a debut winner.
Emissary, won at Kempton, very impressive. Just I'm not sure that the form's all that strong, to be honest, but the time of the last portion of the race was very good, and the way the horse moved just really caught my eye. Sometimes you just get a gut feeling about a horse and the impression that he leaves on you, and I think this one could be a bit special. Again, very, very smart horse from, I think, the family of Workforce. And Workforce, probably one of the most underrated horses talent-wise of the last 20 years for me. Absolutely spellbinding performance in the Derby, and of course he won the Arc as well. Again, it was one of those, on that given day, I don't think anything would have beaten him. So yes, I'm excited that there's another talented horse from that family come along.
Then you've gone for a horse that has had a little more racing than those two, slightly more exposed, but still maybe a horse that we haven't seen the best of.
But yet not that exposed. I was very impressed with him at Doncaster Foxtel of Andrew Balding's, and then really good run at Ascot against better horses. He seems to be relatively adaptable as regards ground, and I think that he can take pretty high order in the big middle distance races this year. It could just set up quite nicely for him. I mean, I don't know how much Racing Enable's going to take or have, and whether they'll try and get her ready for Royal Ascot. But I can see this horse, if they can get a prep into him somewhere, they can get a Group 3 into him. I could see him then running in your Eclipses and your Internationals and your Champion Stakes and being in the mix.
Yeah, he could be one that they'd maybe start in a Brigadier Gerard, which is going to be on early doors, is it? And could go something like that. And
isn't that going to be it? Is that going to be somewhere else? Is it going to be at? Oh, I don't know.
Is it Newmarket? Newmarket or
Haydock?
Yeah,
Newmarket, is it? I don't know. Yeah.
It's we've got some brilliant racing to kick things off actually in the first couple of weeks, and then you've gone for a couple of Roger Charlton horses.
Well, I've gone for French Polish, haven't I?
Yeah.
Who? I've gone for Pocket Square. Pocket Square, I put in. I thought slightly was in the shadow of Quadrilateral last year. Yeah. She didn't win a Group 1, but she won a Group 3 in France. I love the sire, Knight of Thunder. I mean, what an amazing start he had to his stallion career. And it looks as though they're going to go on as well. That's the key. It looks as though they're going to make, proper 3-year-olds as well. I like the fact that she could do it on top of the ground and soft ground. It looks as though she'll get a little bit further. Because Quadrilateral will be racing in our classics, it seems that they might send her to France for a French Guineas at a Prix de Diane or something like that. And it's interesting, actually. It's an interesting parallel, isn't it? The first season Roger Charlton had with a license, 1990, he had the winner of the English Derby and the French Derby, and had the second in the Irish Derby with 3 different horses. And now he might have the winner of the beginnings with quadrilateral, and he might send Pocket Square to France and she could mop up. But I just think she's the one that's not been talked about as much as quadrilateral, but I don't think she's too far behind in terms of talent. And I think she's unexposed insofar as I think a step up in trip might well bring about the best in her.
And what about French Polish? Another one that you would think is going to be suited by a step up in trip, given new approach out of a middle distance winner.
Yeah, this is one of Mrs. Cooper's families, French Polish. Has only run the once and finished down the field, but shaped with quite a bit of promise. I think is held in quite high regard by a trainer as well. And I think I just don't think it's one of those. You try and pick one, don't you? That's sort of finished mid-div in a maiden toward the back end of last year, and French Polish got the nod on pedigree and a pleasing enough first run. So a horse who is likely to probably improve more than just about any other horse I saw running in maidens last back end.
Excellent stuff. That's 5, Lucky. You've gone with a good strong hand there. So hopefully plenty of winners to come. Thanks for joining us.
That'll be the hardest thing I have to do all year, by the way, is actually remember 5 horses. Remember 5 horses that ran at some point last year that aren't in Able or whatever. Yeah.
Actually, last question before I go. Do you have a photographic memory? Because I'm sure you do.
No, not really. I think I have quite a good memory. It's obviously less good than it used to be because I think your memory starts to gradually decline. But yeah, I have a good memory. I do remember weird things, although it's not so good. Like if you'd said to me, "Where did I do my first shift with you?" would I have necessarily said Nottingham? I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, but it's hardly significant. I'm talking about. You seem to remember.
No, that's what I meant. The more insignificant, the better, Chris.
I just know that when you look down a race card and you see the pedigrees, and you can genuinely often reel off the next few members of that family just from the name of the dam.
Are you suggesting that this is something that's just lurking in there rather than me having studied intensely the night before?
Absolutely. I've never seen you studying. I have seen you out in a bar the night before, so I reckon it's just in there.
Yeah, I don't. I have had a good time doing this. It's fair to say I have had a good time doing this.
Excellent stuff. Well,
apologies for it.
No, we'll finish there, Lucky, before we get on to stories that you probably don't want to have to talk about. But thanks for joining us, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you, Chris.